Ladies and gentlemen, today we uncover a hidden reality, a nightmare that remains in the shadows. A place built to restore order has instead become a symbol of fear, oppression, and human suffering. This is the dark side of CECOT, the world's largest mega-prison. In the heart of El Salvador stands one of the most imposing and controversial structures ever built, a facility that has gained global attention for its sheer size and the promises made by its creators. This is CECOT, the Terrorism Confinement Center, a high-security mega-prison designed to house thousands of individuals accused of gang affiliation and criminal activities. It is not just a prison. It is a fortress, covering over 165 hectares of land, equipped with state-of-the-art surveillance, heavily armed guards, and a strict no-contact policy between prisoners and the outside world. When CECOT was unveiled, it was portrayed as a revolutionary solution to El Salvador's gang crisis. The country has long struggled with extreme levels of violence, largely fueled by notorious criminal organizations such as MS-13 and Barrio 18. The government's response was swift and severe, a crackdown that led to the mass incarceration of over 75,000 people, many of whom were swept up in nationwide raids without proper investigations. In the eyes of the authorities, CECOT was not just a prison. It was a statement, a symbol of absolute control over crime and chaos. With a capacity to hold up to 40,000 prisoners, it is considered the largest and most secure facility of its kind. Designed with reinforced walls, high-tech surveillance systems, and 24/7 monitoring, CECOT is structured to ensure that no one escapes and no outside influence interferes. Prisoners are held in complete isolation, with no access to family, legal representation, or even basic human interaction. Inside, the cells are overcrowded, stripped of beds or personal space, and monitored under extreme security measures that strip inmates of any sense of identity or dignity. While the government claims that CECOT has played a pivotal role in reducing crime rates and dismantling criminal organizations, there is a growing concern that this facility represents more than just a tool for law enforcement. It stands as a dark monument to mass incarceration, authoritarian control, and the suppression of human rights. The world sees the exterior of this prison, but few truly understand what happens within its walls. It is not merely a correctional institution. It is a place of suffering, secrecy, and untold stories that must be brought to light. This is the reality of CECOT. It is not just the largest prison in the world. It is one of the most feared. And as we look closer, we begin to uncover the truth behind the steel gates, a truth that challenges the very foundation of justice and human dignity. The creation of CECOT was not an accident, nor was it simply another addition to El Salvador's prison system. It was designed with a clear and ambitious goal, to serve as the ultimate weapon in the government's war on gangs. For decades, El Salvador had been plagued by extreme levels of gang-related violence, with groups like MS-13 and Barrio 18 terrorizing communities, extorting businesses, and controlling entire neighborhoods through fear and brutality. These gangs were not just street criminals. They had evolved into highly organized networks capable of rivaling law enforcement. The people of El Salvador lived under constant threat, with murder rates among the highest in the world. In response, the government launched a state of emergency, granting authorities sweeping powers to arrest anyone suspected of gang affiliation. Thousands of men, many young and from impoverished backgrounds, were detained without trial. The justice system was pushed aside in favor of mass incarceration, and the solution to housing this enormous wave of prisoners was CECOT, a prison designed to crush gang influence and isolate suspected criminals from society indefinitely. From the outside, the concept of CECOT seemed simple. Gather all gang members in one impenetrable facility, sever their ties to the outside world, and eliminate their ability to coordinate criminal activities. The government portrayed it as a triumph of law and order, a facility that would finally bring peace to the streets. The president himself showcased the prison as a necessary step toward national security, emphasizing that these inmates would never see freedom again. The message was clear. El Salvador would no longer be ruled by gangs. It would be ruled by the state. Inside CECOT, Everything is designed to strip prisoners of power, identity, and communication. Unlike traditional prisons, where gang leaders could still exert influence from behind bars, CECOT operates under extreme restrictions. Inmates are constantly monitored by armed guards, locked away in overcrowded, windowless cells with no access to family visits, legal aid, or even outdoor time. Communication is completely cut off. No phones, no letters, no human connection beyond the cold walls of their confinement. The facility was built to break the hierarchy of gangs, ensuring that no orders could be given, no connections maintained, and no influence exerted beyond the prison gates. However, while CECOT was intended to serve as a solution to gang violence, its implementation has raised serious ethical and legal concerns. The government's aggressive crackdown did not differentiate between criminals and innocent civilians caught in the dragnet. With thousands arrested without due process, many people with no proven gang affiliation have found themselves trapped inside this fortress of isolation. Human rights organizations argue that CECOT is not just a prison for gang members. It has become a symbol of unchecked state power, where the accused have no voice, no trial, and no chance of defending themselves. The world was told that CECOT would bring justice. But justice is built on fairness, due process, and respect for human dignity. If a facility built to stop violence becomes a place where rights are stripped away without accountability, can it truly be called a solution? When CECOT was constructed, it was meant to be a prison for the worst criminals in El Salvador, hardened gang members, drug lords, and those responsible for the nation's decades-long terror. However, what unfolded was something far more disturbing, a mass incarceration campaign that swept up not just criminals, but also thousands of innocent civilians. The government's emergency crackdown on crime did not rely on thorough investigations or fair trials. Instead, it was built on a system of arbitrary arrests, where mere suspicion was enough to justify imprisonment. Under the state of emergency declared by the government, constitutional protections were suspended, allowing law enforcement to arrest individuals without warrants. Anyone with tattoos, anyone living in a gang-controlled neighborhood, or even someone simply fitting a vague profile of a gang member could be taken into custody. Overnight, thousands of young men, many with no criminal record, found themselves ripped from their homes, their workplaces, and their families, sent directly to the country's rapidly expanding prison system. CECOT became the centerpiece of this strategy, designed to hold up to 40,000 prisoners at a time. However, inside its walls, the lines between justice and oppression blurred. With the mass influx of detainees, the prison quickly became overcrowded, filled not only with gang members, but also with people who had never committed a crime. Fathers, brothers, sons, and even teenagers were thrown into cells without the chance to defend themselves. Many had no idea why they were arrested, and their families were given no information on their whereabouts. The government's mass incarceration strategy has been praised by some for reducing violence on the streets, but at what cost? A justice system that does not distinguish between the guilty and the innocent is no justice system at all. Families have been torn apart, and communities have been left in fear, not of gangs, but of the government itself. Inside the towering walls of CECOT, conditions are far from what most would consider humane. The government has promoted this mega-prison as a symbol of justice and order, but for those confined within its walls, it is a place of relentless suffering. Built to house 40,000 inmates, the facility operates under extreme conditions designed to break both the bodies and minds of prisoners. The outside world may see a high-tech fortress of security, but inside, the reality is much darker. The cells in CECOT are deliberately overcrowded. Prisoners are crammed together, with little space to move, let alone sleep comfortably. Unlike traditional prisons, where inmates have beds or at least mats, many in CECOT are forced to sleep on the hard concrete floor. There are no blankets, no pillows, and no personal belongings allowed. The lack of proper ventilation and exposure to sunlight only worsens the conditions, creating an environment where illness spreads rapidly. Sanitation is another major issue. With thousands of inmates confined in tight spaces, access to clean water and basic hygiene facilities is severely limited. Prisoners are not given adequate access to showers, leading to severe health problems such as skin infections, rashes, and disease outbreaks. The few toilets available are shared by large groups, often overflowing due to poor maintenance. The stench of filth lingers in the air, adding to the inhumane conditions. There is no access to proper medical care, leaving those who fall ill to suffer without treatment. Perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of CECOT is the extreme isolation. Inmates are completely cut off from the outside world. There are no family visits, no letters, and no legal representation. Many prisoners do not even know if their families are aware of their fate. The absence of any form of human connection strips them of their sense of identity, leaving them to exist in a state of perpetual despair. The guards enforce a strict and brutal routine. Prisoners are not allowed to speak, not even to one another. Any attempt to communicate is met with punishment, beatings, forced starvation, or days of solitary confinement in complete darkness. The psychological toll of such conditions is devastating. Many inmates experience extreme mental distress, with some losing their grip on reality altogether. For them, time ceases to exist. Every day feels like an endless cycle of suffering, with no hope of release or redemption. CECOT was built to control crime, but inside its walls, it has created a new kind of suffering, one where prisoners, regardless of their guilt or innocence, are subjected to relentless physical and psychological torment. CECOT, El Salvador's massive megaprison, was built as a fortress of law and order, designed to house the country's most dangerous criminals. However, while the government presents it as a success in fighting gang violence, reports from inside tell a different story, one of extreme cruelty, human rights violations, and systemic abuse. For many prisoners, CECOT is not just a place of confinement. It is a living nightmare where suffering is constant and dignity is non-existent. The facility has become infamous for its inhumane treatment of inmates, with allegations of torture, physical abuse, and psychological torment surfacing from former detainees and human rights organizations. Physical torture and brutality. One of the most horrifying aspects of CECOT is the reported use of physical torture. Prison guards, operating under strict government orders to maintain absolute control, enforce brutal discipline through violence. Inmates are regularly subjected to beatings, sometimes as punishment, and sometimes simply to instill fear. Reports describe prisoners being struck with batons, kicked, and punched until they collapse. Some are forced into stress positions for hours, with their bodies twisted into unnatural angles, causing unbearable pain. Others are shackled for long periods, denied movement, and left in agonizing discomfort. Many prisoners, already weak from starvation and exhaustion, are unable to withstand such treatment. Some collapse due to dehydration, while others suffer broken bones or internal injuries from excessive force. Medical care is practically non-existent, and those who suffer injuries often receive no treatment, leaving their wounds to fester. Some prisoners who resist or even fail to follow orders precisely are taken into solitary confinement, where they endure further abuse away from the eyes of other inmates. Psychological torment and sensory deprivation. The suffering in CECOT is not just physical, it is deeply psychological. The facility is designed to strip prisoners of their identity and sense of self. Communication with the outside world is completely cut off, with no letters, phone calls, or visits allowed. Many detainees have no idea if their families even know where they are or if they're still alive. Prisoners are subjected to extreme sensory deprivation. Some are kept in complete darkness for days, losing all sense of time. Others are exposed to bright lights 24/7, preventing them from sleeping properly. The silence in certain areas of the prison is enforced so strictly that inmates are not even allowed to whisper to one another. Anyone caught speaking without permission faces harsh punishment, including beatings, food deprivation, or extended solitary confinement. The psychological toll of these conditions is devastating. Many inmates begin to lose their grip on reality, suffering from paranoia, anxiety, and depression. Some break down completely, unable to function after weeks or months of such treatment. Reports suggest that suicide attempts are not uncommon, as prisoners lose all hope of ever escaping the torment they endure daily: lack of food, water, and basic hygiene. In addition to violence and psychological torture, the prison conditions themselves are inhumane. Food is severely rationed, with prisoners receiving only minimal portions, often consisting of low-quality, nutritionally inadequate meals. Many detainees suffer from malnutrition, losing dangerous amounts of weight in just weeks. The lack of proper nutrition weakens their immune systems, making them more vulnerable to disease. Clean drinking water is also scarce. Prisoners often go hours or even days without enough water, leading to dehydration and related health issues. Reports indicate that in some cases, access to water is deliberately restricted as a form of punishment, forcing inmates to endure extreme thirst in sweltering, overcrowded cells. Hygiene is another major issue. Prisoners are rarely allowed to shower, leading to severe skin infections, rashes, and other health complications. Toilets are shared among dozens, sometimes even hundreds, of inmates, often overflowing due to poor maintenance. The stench of human waste fills the air, further degrading the prisoners' living conditions. Without proper sanitation, diseases spread rapidly, yet there is no medical assistance available to treat them. Those who fall ill are left to suffer, and in some cases, prisoners have died from entirely preventable illnesses simply because they were denied medical care. Sexual abuse and gender-based violence. While most reports of abuse focus on physical beatings and psychological torture, there have also been alarming accounts of sexual abuse within CECOT. Female detainees, though fewer in number, have reportedly faced sexual harassment and assault from guards. Even male prisoners are not always safe, as reports suggest that some have been sexually abused as a form of punishment or humiliation. This aspect of the prison's brutality remains one of the least discussed, as victims are often too terrified to speak out. The fear of retaliation keeps many silent, allowing the cycle of abuse to continue unchecked. The lack of oversight within CECOT means that guards operate with near total impunity, and those who commit such crimes face no consequences. The role of the government and impunity. Despite growing evidence of these human rights abuses, the government continues to present CECOT as a success story. Officials deny the allegations of mistreatment, insisting that the prison is simply a necessary tool in the fight against crime. They argue that the inmates deserve no mercy, painting all detainees as dangerous criminals, regardless of whether they were ever given a fair trial. The prison system operates in secrecy, with little to no outside oversight. International human rights organizations have called for investigations into the conditions within CECOT, but the government remains defiant, refusing to allow independent observers inside the facility. Meanwhile, those who speak out against the abuses, journalists, activists, and former detainees, often face threats and intimidation, silencing efforts to expose the truth. The lack of accountability means that abuses continue unchecked, and for those trapped inside CECOT, there is no hope of relief. The world sees the prison as a solution to crime, but inside its walls, thousands are suffering under a system that disregards human dignity and justice. One of the most disturbing aspects of El Salvador's mass incarceration strategy is the complete disregard for due process. In the rush to imprison suspected criminals, the fundamental principles of justice, innocent until proven guilty, the right to legal defense, and a fair trial, have been abandoned. CECOT, the world's largest megaprison, is filled with thousands of inmates who were never given the chance to defend themselves in court. Instead, they were arrested under sweeping emergency measures, detained without evidence, and thrown into a brutal prison system where legal representation is nearly impossible. The Salvadoran government has justified these actions by arguing that extreme measures were necessary to combat extreme gang violence. For decades, the country was plagued by some of the highest murder rates in the world, driven by powerful criminal organizations like MS-13 and Barrio 18. However, in its effort to crack down on gang activity, the government implemented mass arrests that did not differentiate between criminals and innocent civilians. Anyone with suspected gang ties, often based on something as simple as a tattoo, living in a certain neighborhood, or even having a friend or relative with a criminal record, was arrested and sent directly to prison. Arbitrary arrests and the absence of evidence. Under the state of emergency declared by the government, law enforcement was given the power to arrest individuals without warrants, bypassing normal legal procedures. This led to thousands of arbitrary arrests, where people were taken off the streets with little to no evidence against them. Many families reported that their loved ones were detained simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Others were accused based on anonymous tips, false reports, or mere suspicion. In some cases, authorities arrested entire groups of young men from poor neighborhoods, assuming they were affiliated with gangs based solely on their appearance or location. Once arrested, detainees were not given the opportunity to challenge their imprisonment. There were no hearings, no formal charges, and no chance to present evidence in their defense. Instead, they were processed in mass trials where hundreds, sometimes even thousands, of people were sentenced at once, often without any individualized review of their cases. The judges presiding over these trials operated under extreme political pressure, with the government demanding swift convictions to demonstrate the success of its crackdown. The silencing of defense lawyers. For those imprisoned in CECOT, obtaining legal representation is nearly impossible. The government has made it incredibly difficult for defense lawyers to access their clients, blocking communication and restricting attorney visits. In many cases, lawyers are not even informed about the charges against their clients, making it impossible to build a defense. Families trying to hire legal help for their loved ones often find that no lawyer is willing or able to take the case. Lawyers who do attempt to defend detainees face serious risks. Some have reported being threatened or harassed by authorities, accused of sympathizing with criminals simply for trying to uphold the right to a fair trial. Others have been forced to abandon cases out of fear for their own safety. As a result, thousands of prisoners in CECOT remain trapped in a legal limbo, with no one to advocate for their release or even ensure they are being treated fairly. Mass sentencing and the elimination of individual justice. Even for those who do make it to court, the legal process is deeply flawed. Instead of individualized trials, El Salvador has adopted mass sentencing, where hundreds of people are convicted at once. These mass trials often last only minutes, with judges rubber-stamping guilty verdicts without reviewing evidence or listening to individual testimonies. The consequences of this approach are devastating. Many innocent people, arrested without cause, are sentenced to decades in prison alongside actual gang members. Families have no way of proving their loved one's innocence, as the government refuses to release arrest records or provide evidence for most cases. The sheer scale of these convictions means that many cases never receive a second look, leaving innocent people to spend their lives behind bars for crimes they never committed. One of the lesser-known but deeply troubling aspects of CECOT is the exploitation of prisoners through forced labor. While the prison is presented as a place where dangerous criminals are kept under strict control, reports suggest that inmates are being used as a free or extremely cheap labor force under brutal conditions. With no legal rights, no fair compensation, and no ability to refuse, prisoners inside CECOT are subjected to relentless work regimes that benefit the government and private entities while leaving detainees physically and mentally drained. A workforce with no rights. El Salvador's government has promoted its prison labor programs as a way to rehabilitate inmates and contribute to the national economy. However, in reality, these programs function more like a modern form of slavery. Prisoners are forced to perform labor under grueling conditions, with no choice in the matter. Those who refuse to work or fail to meet production targets face severe punishments, including beatings, food deprivation, and isolation in dark, windowless cells. The types of labor vary, but many prisoners are assigned to work in textile production, construction, agriculture, and even manufacturing goods for government projects. Reports indicate that some of the uniforms worn by law enforcement officers and other official workers in El Salvador are produced by inmates in these prison labor programs. Others are put to work maintaining and expanding prison facilities, essentially building the very structures meant to keep them confined. Unlike traditional work programs in correctional facilities, where prisoners might receive a small wage or earn credit toward reduced sentences, the inmates at CECOT receive nothing in return for their labor. They are not allowed to keep earnings, nor do they have any form of workers' rights. The government controls all aspects of their work, and any complaints or resistance are met with harsh retaliation. Extreme working conditions. The conditions under which prisoners work are often extreme. The facilities where they labor are overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and unbearably hot, with inmates forced to work for long hours with little to no breaks. Many are not provided with proper protective equipment, even when handling dangerous materials. Reports indicate that some prisoners have suffered serious injuries on the job, from deep cuts to broken bones, but medical attention is either delayed or denied entirely. The combination of long hours, physical exhaustion, and malnutrition makes prison labor especially brutal. Many inmates are already weak from the lack of proper food and medical care, yet they are expected to perform physically demanding work under these conditions. Some collapse from exhaustion, only to be dragged away and replaced by others. The work does not stop no matter how sick or injured the prisoners become. No hope for freedom through work. In many prison systems around the world, work programs offer inmates a path toward rehabilitation or early release. However, at CECOT, forced labor is not linked to any form of rehabilitation or sentence reduction. Prisoners are not given educational opportunities, vocational training, or any form of personal development that could help them reintegrate into society. Instead, they are treated as disposable laborers, worked to the brink of collapse with no hope of ever earning their way out. This system of forced labor raises serious ethical and legal concerns. International human rights organizations have repeatedly condemned the use of forced prison labor, particularly when inmates are not given a choice in the matter and receive no compensation. However, El Salvador's government continues to expand these labor programs, arguing that they help offset the costs of mass incarceration. For the prisoners trapped inside CECOT, the reality is clear. They are not just serving time. They are being used, exploited, and broken down, both physically and mentally, with no possibility of escape. Beyond the physical suffering endured by prisoners inside CECOT, the psychological torment they experience is just as devastating, if not worse. The prison's strict, oppressive environment is designed not only to control inmates, but to break them mentally and emotionally. The combination of extreme isolation, constant fear, sensory deprivation, and relentless brutality leaves lasting psychological scars that many will never recover from. While the government portrays CECOT as a facility that maintains order and discipline, in reality, it functions as a place where human beings are systematically stripped of their sanity, dignity, and hope. The isolation that destroys minds. One of the most psychologically damaging aspects of life in CECOT is extreme isolation. Inmates are not allowed to have any form of communication with the outside world. They are denied visits from family, letters, or even the most basic legal representation. Many prisoners have no idea whether their families even know where they are, and in some cases, they do not know why they were imprisoned in the first place. This total disconnection from the world leaves inmates feeling abandoned, forgotten, and hopeless. Inside the prison, communication is also heavily restricted. Prisoners are forbidden from speaking to one another, even in their overcrowded cells. The guards enforce a strict code of silence, and anyone caught whispering or making eye contact with another inmate can face severe punishment. This level of forced isolation is not just cruel, it is a form of psychological warfare. Humans are social creatures, and when deprived of interaction for extended periods, the mind begins to deteriorate. Many prisoners inside CECOT suffer from hallucinations, paranoia, and severe anxiety as a result of their isolation. They lose track of time, unsure whether days, weeks, or months have passed. Without any sense of reality or connection to the world, some prisoners completely detach from their own identities, becoming mere shells of their former selves, constant fear and unpredictable violence. Another major factor in the psychological breakdown of inmates is the ever-present fear of violence. At any moment, a prisoner could be singled out for punishment, whether for breaking a rule or simply because a guard decided to make an example of them. Beatings are a regular occurrence, and prisoners are forced to witness the brutal punishment of others, knowing they could be next. This constant atmosphere of unpredictability and terror leads to severe psychological distress. Many inmates develop symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, with some experiencing panic attacks, nightmares, and uncontrollable anxiety. Others fall into deep depression, unable to cope with the daily horrors they face. Some become so psychologically broken that they no longer react to anything around them, completely numb to their suffering. The use of sensory deprivation as a psychological weapon. CECOT does not only rely on physical abuse to break prisoners, it also employs sophisticated psychological torture techniques, including sensory deprivation. Inmates in solitary confinement are kept in pitch-black cells for days or even weeks at a time, with no exposure to sunlight or fresh air. Others are subjected to bright artificial lights 24/7, preventing them from sleeping and disrupting their mental stability. In these conditions, prisoners lose their sense of reality. Many begin to experience auditory and visual hallucinations, hearing voices, or seeing things that are not there. The mind, deprived of normal stimuli, begins to create its own distorted reality. Some prisoners, unable to withstand the torture, begin talking to themselves, screaming uncontrollably, or engaging in self-harm as a desperate attempt to escape their own minds. Sleep deprivation and mental collapse. Another method of psychological torture in CECOT is sleep deprivation. Prisoners are often woken up at random hours of the night for sudden inspections or forced to stand for hours without rest. In some cases, loud noises, such as alarms, metal doors slamming, or guards shouting, are deliberately used to prevent inmates from sleeping. The human brain cannot function properly without sleep. After just a few days of severe sleep deprivation, cognitive function declines, making it difficult to think clearly, remember things, or process emotions. After weeks or months, sleep deprivation can lead to hallucinations, paranoia, and extreme mood swings. Some prisoners become so disoriented that they no longer know whether they are awake or dreaming. The breaking of the human spirit. Perhaps the most devastating psychological effect of CECOT's brutal conditions is the complete destruction of the human spirit. Many prisoners enter the facility still holding on to the hope that they will be proven innocent, that they will get a second chance, or that their suffering will one day end. But over time, as the days blend into weeks and months, that hope fades. With no legal representation, no contact with loved ones, and no idea if they will ever be released, inmates slowly lose all sense of purpose. Some stop eating, refusing to continue living under such unbearable conditions. Others withdraw completely, refusing to speak, move, or react to their surroundings. The most broken prisoners are those who no longer resist, no longer care, and no longer believe in anything, including their own existence. The psychological collapse of these inmates is not a side effect of the prison system. It is an intentional result of its design. CECOT was not just built to detain prisoners. It was built to crush them, to erase their humanity, and to ensure that those who enter never leave the same person they once were. CECOT, El Salvador's notorious megaprison, was built to hold tens of thousands of inmates, but its design prioritizes punishment over human welfare. The overcrowding within its walls is beyond inhumane, with prisoners packed into cells like animals, deprived of even the most basic necessities. This extreme congestion creates a perfect environment for disease to spread uncontrollably, turning the facility into a death trap where illness and suffering are just as deadly as violence and abuse. While the government claims that the prison maintains strict order, the reality inside tells a different story, one of neglect, unsanitary conditions, and a complete disregard for the health and well-being of inmates. With limited medical care, poor nutrition, and no hygiene facilities, infectious diseases run rampant, and for many prisoners, a minor illness can quickly become a death sentence. Cells packed beyond capacity. CECOT was designed to house around 40,000 prisoners, but reports suggest that its population is rapidly growing. As mass arrests continue under El Salvador's emergency crackdown on crime, the government keeps sending thousands more detainees into the facility, often without trials or evidence. The result is extreme overcrowding, with prisoners crammed into tiny cells with no space to move, sleep, or even breathe properly. Many cells that were originally built for a few dozen prisoners now hold hundreds. There are no beds, no mattresses, just cold concrete floors where inmates are forced to sit or sleep shoulder to shoulder. In some areas, prisoners must take turns sleeping because there is not enough room for everyone to lie down at once. The suffocating heat, combined with the lack of ventilation, makes it nearly impossible to rest, leaving inmates in a constant state of exhaustion and discomfort. Unsanitary conditions and lack of clean water. Hygiene is non-existent in CECOT. The prison does not provide inmates with proper sanitation, and many prisoners go weeks without bathing. Toilets, if they exist at all, are shared by hundreds of people, often overflowing due to lack of maintenance. The stench of human waste fills the air, creating unbearable living conditions. With no access to clean water, prisoners are unable to wash their hands, brush their teeth, or even rinse their faces, leading to rapid outbreaks of disease. Skin infections, fungal diseases, and infestations of lice and scabies are common. Prisoners develop painful sores and rashes from being unable to clean themselves, and without medical attention, these conditions worsen, leading to severe infections. In some cases, inmates suffer from open wounds that become infested with maggots, yet they receive no treatment. The spread of deadly diseases. Overcrowding and poor sanitation create the perfect conditions for infectious diseases to spread like wildfire. Respiratory illnesses, such as tuberculosis, are rampant due to prisoners being forced to live in close quarters with no fresh air. Coughing, sneezing, and breathing the same stagnant air mean that if one prisoner becomes sick, hundreds of others are soon infected. Gastrointestinal diseases, including severe diarrhea and food poisoning, are also widespread due to contaminated food and water. Many prisoners suffer from chronic stomach pain, vomiting, and dehydration, yet medical care is either limited or completely unavailable. Those who contract serious infections are left to suffer, and in many cases, prisoners have died simply because they did not receive basic antibiotics or hydration. Malnutrition weakens prisoners' immune systems, making them even more vulnerable to disease. The food provided in CECOT is often rotten, moldy, or insect-infested, lacking the necessary nutrients to sustain basic health. Many inmates lose drastic amounts of weight in just weeks, their bodies deteriorating as they struggle to fight off illness with no medical support. The absence of medical care. Despite the severe health crises inside CECOT, medical care is almost non-existent. There are no proper hospital facilities within the prison, and the few medical staff available are overwhelmed and under-equipped. Prisoners who fall seriously ill are often ignored, left to suffer until they either recover on their own or die. Those who beg for medical attention are often met with brutality instead of treatment. Guards see illness as a sign of weakness, not as a condition that requires care. Even in cases where prisoners do receive medical attention, it is often inadequate or even harmful. Inmates have reported being given expired medications, incorrect dosages, or even being denied pain relief for serious injuries. Those suffering from chronic illnesses, such as diabetes or hypertension, are rarely provided with the medication they need, leading to preventable complications that can result in permanent disability or death. Deaths that go unreported. With the complete lack of medical care, it is no surprise that deaths inside CECOT are frequent. Yet, the government does everything possible to keep these deaths hidden from the public. Bodies are removed quietly, and families are often not informed of their loved ones' deaths until long after they have already been buried in unmarked graves. There are reports of prisoners dying from preventable illnesses, dehydration, starvation, and even untreated injuries. Others have simply collapsed due to the unbearable conditions, their bodies unable to withstand the relentless suffering. Yet, no investigations are conducted, no accountability is taken, and the government continues to insist that the prison is functioning as intended. For the inmates of CECOT, the reality is clear. Disease is just another form of execution. Whether through malnutrition, untreated infections, or the spread of deadly illnesses, prisoners are dying at alarming rates, and no one is being held responsible. CECOT is more than just a prison. It is a place where death is routine and accountability is non-existent. While the government claims that this high-security facility is simply a tool for maintaining order, the reality inside its walls tells a much darker story. Prisoners are not just serving time. They are dying under mysterious and horrific circumstances, with their deaths rarely investigated or even acknowledged. The lack of oversight, the extreme secrecy surrounding the prison's operations, and the absolute control exercised by the authorities mean that countless deaths occur without consequence. Whether through brutal beatings, medical neglect, forced starvation, or outright executions disguised as accidents, prisoners inside CECOT are quietly disappearing, their fates hidden from the outside world. Families never receive answers, and the government continues to expand its prison policies without addressing the growing human rights crisis. Prisoner deaths, statistics that don't exist. One of the most alarming aspects of CECOT's operations is the complete lack of transparency regarding prisoner fatalities. Official statistics on deaths inside the prison are either non-existent or heavily manipulated. Unlike in other prison systems where deaths are at least documented, CECOT operates in a shroud of secrecy, ensuring that the true number of inmates who perish behind its walls is never made public. International human rights organizations and journalists have struggled to obtain any reliable data about mortality rates inside the facility. Reports indicate that dozens, perhaps even hundreds, of prisoners have already died under suspicious circumstances, yet their deaths are either attributed to natural causes or never reported at all. Many families have gone months or even years without any word about their loved ones, only to be informed later that they had died in custody, often without any details or official documentation. Beatings that turn into death sentences. Physical abuse is rampant in CECOT, and for many inmates, a routine beating quickly turns into a death sentence. Guards, operating with unchecked power, frequently use brutal force to maintain order and discipline. Prisoners are kicked, punched, and struck with batons, often sustaining serious injuries such as broken ribs, fractured skulls, and internal bleeding. In some cases, these injuries are so severe that inmates die within days, either from the direct trauma or from infections due to the lack of medical care. Yet, instead of acknowledging these deaths, the authorities simply remove the bodies, dispose of them in secrecy, and continue as if nothing happened. Some prisoners are dragged out of their cells after being severely beaten, never to be seen again. Others die in the very cells they are confined to, their bodies left untouched for hours or even days before being discreetly removed. Torture as a death sentence. Beyond physical beatings, there are reports of systematic torture taking place within CECOT. Prisoners who are suspected of breaking rules or attempting to resist are subjected to extreme forms of punishment, including electric shocks, mock executions, and prolonged periods of starvation. Some are placed in solitary confinement for weeks or months, deprived of food, water, and human contact, until their bodies can no longer endure the suffering. In many ways, these torturous conditions amount to slow executions. Prisoners who do not die immediately often deteriorate mentally and physically until they are no longer recognizable. Some lose the will to live, refusing to eat or drink, while others become so weakened by malnutrition and untreated infections that they simply fade away. Guards do not intervene to prevent these deaths. In fact, they often encourage them, seeing the deaths of prisoners as a way to reduce overcrowding without legal complications. Medical neglect leading to unnecessary deaths. While brutal beatings and torture contribute to many deaths inside CECOT, an even larger number of fatalities occur due to deliberate medical neglect. Sick and injured prisoners are routinely denied treatment, left to suffer in agony without pain relief or basic medical attention. Even those with serious conditions such as infections, respiratory illnesses, or untreated wounds are often ignored until it is too late. Many prisoners die from entirely preventable causes, such as dehydration, malnutrition, or common infections that could have been treated with basic antibiotics. Yet, rather than providing care, the prison authorities allow these prisoners to waste away, knowing that their deaths will go unnoticed by the outside world. Those who beg for help are either ignored or beaten for complaining, ensuring that others remain silent about their suffering. The cover-up of deaths inside CECOT. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of prisoner deaths inside CECOT is the systematic effort to cover them up. Families of inmates who have died are rarely informed in a timely manner. Sometimes they are not even told at all. When they do receive news, it often comes with vague explanations, such as sudden illness or heart failure, with no autopsy reports or medical records to confirm the cause of death. In some cases, bodies are disposed of before families are even notified, buried in mass graves or cremated to erase any evidence of mistreatment. Others are returned to their loved ones with clear signs of torture and abuse, yet families are too afraid to speak out, knowing that any attempt to seek justice could lead to retaliation. Extrajudicial killings disguised as accidents. There are growing concerns that some deaths inside CECOT are not just the result of neglect or mistreatment, but deliberate executions carried out by prison authorities. Some prisoners, particularly those suspected of being former gang members or those who defy the harsh conditions, are never seen again after being taken away by guards. Their disappearances are either ignored or explained away as attempted escapes or sudden medical emergencies. Eyewitness accounts from released prisoners suggest that some inmates are selected for execution under the guise of maintaining order. These individuals are taken to isolated areas within the prison, subjected to brutal interrogations, and never return. In some cases, their bodies are discovered days later, with their deaths officially attributed to self-inflicted injuries or natural causes. In reality, these are extrajudicial killings, silent executions that leave no record, no investigation, and no accountability. A system that thrives on death. CECOT is not just a prison. It is a machine designed to dehumanize, torture, and ultimately eliminate those who are deemed unworthy of life. With no legal oversight, no independent monitoring, and no consequences for the brutal treatment of inmates, the deaths inside CECOT are not accidents. They are the intended result of a system built on fear, violence, and absolute power. For those who enter its walls, survival is never guaranteed. Some may serve their sentences and eventually leave, but many others will simply disappear, their names erased from history, their deaths unnoticed, and their suffering ignored. While CECOT is officially presented as a facility designed to control crime and maintain security, there is another, more sinister function that few speak about: the exploitation of prisoners as forced laborers. Behind the high walls and barbed wire, thousands of inmates are subjected to grueling, unpaid work, transforming the prison into a hidden economic engine that benefits those in power. Prison labor is often justified as a means of rehabilitation, a way for inmates to contribute to society while serving their sentences. However, at CECOT, this is not the case. Prisoners are not given a choice, nor are they compensated for their labor. Instead, they are treated as a disposable workforce, forced to perform backbreaking tasks under extreme conditions with no legal protections or rights. Those who refuse to comply face severe punishments, including beatings, starvation, or extended periods in solitary confinement. A workforce of captives. Inside CECOT, prisoners are used for various forms of labor, ranging from construction and maintenance work to manufacturing and agricultural tasks. Some are forced to produce goods, which are then sold for profit, while others are assigned to physically demanding jobs that would otherwise require paid workers outside the prison. These tasks are not designed to help inmates develop skills or prepare them for life after release. They are purely about extracting as much labor as possible, regardless of the human cost. One of the most brutal aspects of this system is the complete lack of concern for the health and well-being of the workers. Inmates are expected to toil for hours without rest, often in dangerous conditions with little to no safety equipment. If someone is injured on the job, they receive no medical treatment, and in many cases, they are simply replaced by another prisoner, as if they were nothing more than machines. The role of forced labor in the prison's economy. CECOT does not operate in isolation. It is part of a larger economic system that thrives on mass incarceration. By using prisoners as a cheap, expendable labor force, the authorities reduce costs while increasing profits. The products made by inmates often find their way into government projects or private contracts, allowing those in power to benefit financially from the suffering of those behind bars. Reports suggest that prison labor in CECOT is used to produce everything from furniture and textiles to construction materials and agricultural goods. Some of these products may even be sold outside the prison system, creating a hidden supply chain where consumers unknowingly purchase goods made under conditions of extreme exploitation. Meanwhile, the inmates themselves see no compensation for their work, and their families receive no financial support from their labor. Punishment through exhaustion. For many prisoners, forced labor is not just a form of exploitation, it is a method of punishment. Inmates who are deemed problematic or disobedient are often assigned to the most physically demanding tasks such as breaking rocks, digging trenches, or carrying heavy loads for hours in the scorching sun. These tasks are designed to push prisoners to their physical limits, breaking their bodies as well as their spirits. Guards enforce strict discipline during work hours, ensuring that prisoners do not slow down or attempt to resist. Anyone caught slacking or showing signs of exhaustion is met with immediate and brutal consequences. In some cases, prisoners collapse from dehydration, malnutrition, or sheer exhaustion, only to be dragged away and replaced by another worker. There is no concern for their survival, only for maintaining the pace of production. The absence of legal protections. International labor laws prohibit forced labor and require fair wages for workers, even in prison settings. However, CECOT operates with complete disregard for these laws. Prisoners have no legal recourse to challenge their conditions, and there are no independent monitors ensuring that human rights are being upheld. The government justifies this system by claiming that inmates are repaying their debt to society, but in reality, they are being used as modern-day slaves, with no possibility of escape or relief. Unlike in some prison labor programs worldwide, where inmates may receive minimal wages or vocational training, CECOT offers nothing. There is no opportunity for inmates to learn useful skills, no savings to help them reintegrate into society upon release, and no pathway to a better future. Instead, they are treated as disposable tools, to be used until they are broken and replaced. A system built on suffering. The forced labor system within CECOT is not about rehabilitation, it is about control and exploitation. It strips prisoners of their humanity, reducing them to mere instruments of profit and punishment. Whether they are manufacturing goods, maintaining the prison, or performing hard labor under the threat of violence, these inmates are trapped in a system designed to extract as much as possible from them while giving nothing in return. And for those who refuse, resist, or simply cannot keep up with the grueling demands, the consequences are swift and merciless. The torment inflicted by CECOT does not end at the prison walls. It extends far beyond, reaching the families of those who have been swallowed by the system. For the loved ones of inmates, life becomes a painful waiting game, filled with uncertainty, fear, and desperation. They are denied basic information about their relatives, left to wonder whether they are alive, injured, or even dead. Governments often justify mass incarceration by claiming that it provides justice for victims and safety for society. But what about the families of those imprisoned? Many are innocent bystanders, people who have lost a father, son, brother, or husband overnight, with no explanation. For them, CECOT is a black hole, a place where their loved ones disappear, leaving only silence in their place. No contact, no communication. For most prisons, even the harshest ones, there are systems in place that allow families to visit, write letters, or receive phone calls from inmates. These small lifelines help maintain a connection between prisoners and the outside world. But inside CECOT, such privileges are non-existent. Families are given no way to check on their loved ones. Visits are rare, if not outright banned. Letters never arrive. Phone calls are unheard of. It is as if the inmates have ceased to exist. Mothers spend sleepless nights wondering whether their sons are still breathing. Children grow up without knowing if they will ever see their fathers again. Wives and sisters wait outside prison gates for hours, hoping to receive even a single piece of news, only to be met with silence. This complete lack of communication is intentional. It isolates inmates, ensuring they feel entirely abandoned. It also punishes their families, forcing them to endure emotional suffering without answers. False hope and official lies. For families desperate for information, the government provides little more than vague reassurances or outright lies. Officials claim that prisoners are being treated humanely, that they are receiving adequate food, medical care, and legal process. But those who have seen the truth, through leaked photos, secret messages, or former inmates, know better. Some families are told that their loved ones will be released soon, only for months or years to pass with no change. Others are given conflicting reports. One day, their relative is alive and well. The next, they have mysteriously died of natural causes. In many cases, bodies are never returned, leaving families without even the closure of a funeral. Desperation turns to resistance. Over time, many families grow tired of waiting. They demand answers, they protest, they call for justice. But speaking out against the prison system is dangerous. Many who ask too many questions are threatened into silence. Some are harassed by authorities, labeled as troublemakers, or even accused of criminal activity themselves. Despite the risks, some continue to fight. Mothers, wives, and sisters form groups, demanding accountability for the suffering of their loved ones. They share stories, spread awareness, and refuse to let the world forget those who have been locked away. But for many, the battle is endless. Until CECOT is exposed for what it truly is, they will remain trapped in a cycle of uncertainty, heartbreak, and unanswered questions.